Thank you. I'd like to introduce Leslie Richardson. She is the director for the Center of Advancement of Teaching Resources. She's going to talk about resources, assistance, and events. And she has handouts, which we're going to help her with.
Jennifer and Chantal asked me to come and talk about resources and the things that our center offers you, but since they gave me 45 minutes, I couldn't resist the impulse to make this a very quick working session too. So I have some handouts that I'm going to give you in a minute. So I see lots and lots of familiar faces, so a lot of you already know, and so you probably know about the resources that we offer. But hello to the rest of you. Nice to see you. Good morning. Thank you very much for listening to me. Our center offers a number of things, mostly in person though, not online, which I guess is a little bit ironic for talking about teaching online. But we offer orientations for new faculty. We have a TA certification process. You're probably more interested in our faculty learning groups and book groups. I brought a couple of the books that we're using this semester just because they're particularly interesting ones. We had a great session on teaching online. So it was a faculty working group that I think was pretty productive for the people in there. We're just finishing up this book called Make It Stick, which is the recent research on cognition. And this was a really fascinating one. Lots of great ideas for helping your students to learn things transformatively rather than just sort of hold them in their declarative memories until they regurgitate them on an exam and then commence the forgetting. We had a book group using this great book called Teaching Naked about teaching hybrid classes. So using technology outside of the classroom so that we can use our very precious in-class time to the maximum, right? So the students are actually engaging with the material and practicing and getting lots of feedback rather than getting more just sort of information dumped on them in class. We also do one-on-one consultations. We do syllabus clinics. We do pretty much anything that you want. We come to classes at midterm if faculty invite us and get feedback from students and then meet with you and talk about what students say about their learning experience and how we could improve it. Excuse me. We're just a resource for you in general. The thing that I wanted to talk about most though, because it's going to lead me to my little working session, is the Provost Course Design Institute. So this is the second year that this last year was the second year that we had a 2-week Course Design Institute. And that I think has been one of our most productive things because it's sustained time to think about designing your class and get peer feedback on your exercises, your learning goals, the way things are measured, and all sorts of anything that you can think of from the ground up with your class, right? And so there's no way that we can duplicate that in 45 minutes, but I wanted to think about just a couple of the kind of fun things that will get us started with that. Okay, so I'm going to hand out these. Oops. Okay, my slide looks a little funny. It's supposed to say why course design. And I just wanted to give you this as a testimonial. This is from a history professor. This is what she said so very eloquently about having taken the time to redesign her course. Right? It was very nice, very nicely put. I've created new courses and retooled old ones more times than I care to remember. All too often, the results of my efforts have felt like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Okay, so what we did in the Course Design Institute is more or less a backward design process, right? So we asked people to actually design a class from the end backwards, right? So what is it that we want to achieve? Okay, how do we make that happen? How do we put it together? We have a tendency not actually to design our classes, right? I know that in my own teaching career, I have mostly thought about these things the semester, the weekend before. Oh dear, I need a syllabus. Well, how would my professors have taught this, right? I'm an English professor, so my course design has mostly consisted of a list of texts that we're going to read, right? And we're going to gallop through those things. It never even occurred to me for years and years and years to think about what is it that I want my students to take away from this class? What are they going to learn? Instead, I was just thinking about what I wanted to talk about, right? It was all about the things that are interesting to me. That's not actually course design, of course, right? But that's how most of us do it because that's the kind of classes that we took, right? But so Kirsten gave us this nice testimonial after she stopped to think about what is it that I actually want my students to have, to take away with them after they finish their semester with me? And so how will I design their learning experience to make that happen, right? So when we're much more intentional about that, we can make a much better learning experience for our students. Now, teaching online, I always consider to be kind of the high wire of teaching, right? So when we're teaching face to face, we have a lot of leeway, right? We could get away with a lot, just from charisma, for those of you who have it, right? Or a smile, right? Or eye contact, right? It makes a big difference. But when you're teaching online, of course, everything has to be planned in a much more concrete way. So we really have to think about those things that are required for learning, right? Some goals, some very clear goals for students to see. They need to know what they need to achieve. Then they need practice, right? They need practice in trying to achieve those goals, and they need feedback, right? Now, once you've got all of your ideas for that set up so that you can teach a really effective online class, then you can take that back to your face-to-face classes and enrich them, right? Because now you have been much more thoughtful about what needs to happen with the time, right? It may not be quite as much fun, right? But it gives us this opportunity to really, really think about what needs to happen in the class. And so what I want us to do is kind of go through the very first steps of course design and think about like the fun bit, right? The most fun bit. That little guy was D. Fink, who wrote a really nice book, and also we've got a compressed version on creating significant learning experiences. He's kind of the guru of course design, and he has lots of fun, lots of really smart stuff to say. And I'm going to skip over him a little bit. But what I'd like you to do is think for just a few minutes about the first question here. What do you want your students to gain from your class? Right? So we know that forgetting sets in pretty soon after the end of the semester. Right? They've finished their final exam and forgetting commences. Right? But how do you want your students to be transformed by taking your class? If you're, being pie in the sky and thinking in an ideal world, how are these students different now? How are they different from anybody else because they had your class, right? If there are just a couple of things that they're going to take away from them, that they're still going to know if you bump into them sometime 3 or 5 years from now, what are those going to be? Right? I know that's really two questions, but if you could just write them down, take a few minutes to think about that. Right? What are the things that you want your class to do to your students? Okay, you can keep writing, of course, because I'm sure that you've got exciting things. Before we go on, would a couple of people like to tell us what you wrote down that you would like your students to gain or glean from your class? Mike.
I broke it down into two categories because I teach both STEM majors and non-STEM majors, and I have different dreams for each. If they're a non-STEM major, 2 to 3 years down the road, I'd like them to at least recognize problems for which mathematics can be brought to bear. Even if they may not remember the specific technique, maybe they could recognize, this is something I could, and then they can go back and, dig up my notes or find on YouTube the particular steps. For a STEM major, my dream is to convert them to a math major, or at least a minor.
All right, great.
I am a professor in the health sciences, and basically what I want them to know is to change the way they think about health and disease. Understanding and critical thinking, which I think is a basis for the problem solving that they have to do to treat people.
I wrote mine for a specific course, but I can generalize the idea to other courses. And the one I was thinking about is data structures, because it's a programming course. And so what I have is have a solid foundation and understanding of data structures where they can explain what each one is, apply and use the most appropriate data structure to a given situation, and be able to evaluate and refine their algorithms for higher efficiency. So I tend to think of things that are really concrete for a particular class, but realizing it kind of generalizes.
So yeah, some of us are thinking of very concrete things, and some of us are not, right? Sometimes some of you have maybe loftier goals, or some of us are very focused on the concrete. But when I ask this question, I find that for many of us, the things that we write don't really look very much like the learning objectives that are on our syllabus, right? The learning objectives tend to be the concrete things, that you're going to be able to define this and apply this and so forth. They don't usually say, I want you to learn to think independently and resist popular media, right? Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Measurable.
It's very useful to have measurable things, right, Pat?
For mine, I have, because I teach environmental studies courses, one of mine is to appreciate different perspectives on complex issues. Because in many of our classes, unconsciously, we tend to give students a certain perspective based on our own relationship. The second one is to know how to evaluate sources of information so that students can make the best decisions they can. And those are my main two objectives. And rather than specific learning outcomes, the learning outcomes are derived as measurable things from these two objectives. And that's usually how I try to structure it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I don't at all mean it as a criticism that we may have goals that are not what the objectives look like on our syllabus, but instead to say those things are important, right? We have a tendency to think that they're supposed to be excluded from our syllabus because we need to have all these concrete goals, but we're not all that likely. Oh, okay, thank you. To achieve really powerful learning if that's all we think about. If all we think about is, defining this term from this chapter, right? Now we can design a class modules very effectively, but the overarching class may not reach our students in any kind of profound way if we don't think about a few other things as well. And so that's what I wanted us to very briefly address. Shane?
So your comment about wanting students to question the status quo reminded me a lot of what I do in my history courses. What I wrote in on my sheet was that I want students to see history everywhere and ask historical questions like, how did this get this way? And does this thing I'm seeing line up with America's ideals or not? I find it really interesting to try to figure out how I can measure when a student has developed this skill, because I know what it means to see history everywhere, because I spend my time examining the suburban sprawl of Miami every day, and I know where it came from. But reverse engineering, how did I come to know that? And finding a way to design those experiences really so that students will have that experience without me having to tell them about suburban sprawl explicitly. They'll come to their own conclusions that works way better than me just trying to preach to them about suburban sprawl or whatever.
Great. And so this is exactly where I'm hoping that we're going to go, right? That was a very, very useful point. Deborah?
One of the things I wanted to mention that I actually learned from you guys was taking those, the concrete objectives and tying them in with the higher level, more generalized objectives. Because I used to be real bad at coming up with concrete objectives until you guys helped me with that, and making the connection made a big change in how I teach.
Thanks. I mean, that's one of the things that we'll help you with in the course design if you sign up for that, and I'll tell you about it later. But we also want to think about the other half that we tend to ignore, right? And so I'm rushing you through this. You would get a lot more time if you come and visit us this summer and think about course design. For many of us, though, our dreams and our syllabus kind of look like they're on different planets, right? That would tend to be the case for me for many years, right? And I'm trying to make them a little bit more coherently aligned lately. But it's because we have a tendency to focus on just the right-hand side. This is of this circle here. And this is Fink's taxonomy. That's the little guy that I showed you before, who's the course design guru. You'll probably notice that the right-hand side, foundational knowledge, application, and integration, those all kind of lined up with some of the stuff from Bloom's taxonomy that we've seen, right? That we start with just knowledge and then understanding and then critical thinking. And those are the things that we're much more comfortable teaching, right? But what I want to talk about today is the left-hand side, the stuff that we are a little bit more nervous about, and the stuff that we're much less likely to address when we're designing our class. But I would say that we have to address these things, or we're not really making a well-rounded learning experience for our students, right? So Shane's example is already showing us how having them engage with Miami and urban sprawl might help them to feel the reality of certain things in different ways. But so I would like to suggest that if we can address this other side, we're going to help our students be better learners of our material, right? Now, learning how to learn, that should be pretty straightforward. We don't typically think of our classes as study skills classes, but if we teach our students how to be good learners in our discipline, if we teach them how to read effectively in the discipline, if we teach them to be metacognitive, if we teach them to be self-regulating learners, if we teach them to ask questions and make a habit of asking particular kinds of questions to evaluate evidence, if we teach them how to be good learners, they're going to do better in our classes, right? So it's an important thing to build in. I would also very much want to stipulate that I'm not asking you to add extra stuff that will take time away from the content, because if we do all of these things, the students will learn the content and the thinking more effectively, right? Caring, that sounds kind of squishy, I realize, right? That we think, oh, I'm not supposed to teach my students to care. But in fact, we all want them to care about our fields, right? If I'm teaching public health, I want students to realize that this is of enormous gravity, right? That is something to be taken seriously. I teach the 18th century, right? I even want them to care about that for reasons that I won't explain right now. If you're teaching a class on coral reefs, you probably really want students to care about the destruction of coral reefs, to think that this is an urgent issue, right? This is about life on Earth, right? Whatever it is that you're teaching, you want them to be invested in it. And if we can invoke their emotion, if we can get them to care about the loss of those charismatic megafauna, or if we can get them to care about public health issues, or if we can get them to care about psychology or criminology or whatever it is, then they're going to learn more powerfully, right? It's going to stick with them, and they're going to be willing to put more energy into learning in the first place, right? So that when we can understand the systems and when we have an emotional investment, we learn far more powerfully. And so Mike, I think, even manages to get students to care about calculus, right? Okay. That's a greater challenge, perhaps, than history, but it can be done, right? But we want them to be interested, right? So it's not just that we're trying to affect their values in a squishy kind of way, but we want them to be invested in the learning experience. And we also are responsible for helping them to develop in a human dimension, right? We may want them to learn about effective ways to collaborate with colleagues, right? We may want them to learn to work effectively in groups. We may want them to learn to peer review other people's papers, right? We may want them to learn to communicate effectively, right? To deal with other people. We may want them to be reflective and self-analyzing, right? There are lots of human dimension skills that we might want to wrap into our classes also. And again, these are not things that are just added on, but instead they will strengthen the more sort of traditional learning that's happening in your classes if we can manage to affect these things. So the next section here, and I think we'll probably have to make it pretty quick, but the next section asks you to think about what kind of goals for your one particular class that you're thinking of you might have in those three dimensions. So this is only the left-hand side. I know you got the right-hand side covered, but you might not have made these parts explicit before. Okay, I know that 3 minutes is probably not all the time you need to reflect on this, right? This is really should be a long process, so we're doing this in a sort of a slightly absurd miniature today. But what we're also probably going to find when you come up with your goals in these dimensions is that we're less certain about how to measure them, right? As you pointed out already, right? The measurableness seems to be sometimes our obstacle. But there may be ways that we can measure things without necessarily assigning grades to them, right? So if we could brainstorm just a little bit, if some of you would like to tell us some of the things that you would like to articulate as goals, and then maybe the rest of us can help you think about how we might take some steps towards measuring those things.
Start in my environmental realm. And the first human dimension goal is that no individual can be completely objective about the world. Many ways of knowing about the natural world. What any person does has consequences for others. And what are they willing to do now to give best chance of a quality life later?
I focus a lot on the last part, learning how to learn. Because I find that a lot of online students are very new to the experience. And, you know, best practices say the first week should be you're getting to know your students and not to cover heavy subject matter. So I make it a learning how to pace yourself in your online course week. I actually provide them with all the videos that you all sent out with I forget who it's from. Dr. Chu. they watch the Dr. Chu videos, and then they discuss them as part of their introduction on how they plan to be more successful in the course. So.
As far as what the students learn about themselves, I'm hoping that they learn that too many of them have just been memorizing math all these years and not understanding it, and that there's no way they'll ever be good at math, and that having a great memory is not a marketable job skill. As far as interacting with others, I try and promote group study, and the really good students tend to think that, that's not helpful because they spend all their time explaining it to others and they don't get the benefit. And I try and get them to understand that it takes a higher level of understanding to explain it to another person than to just do the problem themselves, and that they do benefit from that, not just the weaker students.
Also, in math classes, sometimes we have a tacit goal to help students conquer their fear of math, right? A lot of our students, I think, have a very fixed mindset about math. Here's one of our books is about mindset, right? And we tend to have fixed mindsets and think, oh, I'm just not a math person. I can't do that. And so it would be both a learning how to learn and a learning about oneself goal to learn that actually math is a skill that's effortful to acquire, right? It's going to take a lot of time and persistence, and everyone struggles with it, but I can do it, right? That's a pretty tough learning obstacle, right? But a pretty important goal that I think a lot of math classes may have but never articulate, right? And so if we can address those kinds of things explicitly, then again we can help our students to be better students, right? Because they tend, and this happens in other places than math, right? People think, well, I'm just not good at this, right? It seems very difficult and confusing, so I must just not have it in me, right? I'm not cut out for this. And so very often it would be important for us to make that an explicit learning goal, that I want students to realize that this is a tough subject, but they can do it, right? That it's going to take some persistence, but persistence is for everyone. It's not that for some people it's really easy, and for the rest of us we don't belong here, right? And that is a really widespread misconception, right? That I think a lot of our students battle, right? So we can do them a lot of favors if we help them to get past that kind of stuff, right? And to realize that it's okay to depend on their group mates, right? That it's okay if I didn't understand it this time, this person explained it to me, next time it might be the other way around, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That try to do is tie it into how it affects their pocketbook. Because I teach a Earth resources oriented course, so the gas that they use in their car, the electricity bill that they pay, the goods and services that make it, all are basically connected to resources in some way. So conservation and money saving, by the end, I think they realize that minimal changes that they can make does have an impact. And when you always talk about money, everybody seems to listen, so that's a good way that I've dealt with the caring issue.
Hi, I teach forensic chemistry. So in terms of caring goals, I think that making them to realize that developing critical thinking, objectivity, and ethics will definitely lead them to be better professionals.
Yeah, that's a really great point, that we don't typically think about teaching ethics in the chemistry class, right? But that's very important, right? So that's a really great point. Any others you want to throw out there? Laura?
I teach cell biology, so it's pretty easy to play out health implications from these various things. And if they go wrong, for example, today we went through why the ramen noodle diet is a bad idea. And it tied in directly with the cellular stuff that we had just been talking about, so they totally got it. So I'm hoping to teach them a little more about how to proactively care for themselves, but also not say really careless things like, wow, cancer's really cool. Because some of their classmates actually have family members who are sick, right? So we present this in a really kind of careful way and make sure that they recognize the human dimension of that as well.
So these are all exciting classes. I wish I could go take them all, right? Because the human dimension, again, makes everything more powerful, right? It's like the jet fuel for your class. If students care about things, then all of a sudden stuff is not abstract. It's not a bunch of unrooted facts that you're asking them to memorize. They can begin to say, oh, that's why this is important. And they can start to harness their new learning to things that they already know and care about, right? And that's really powerful for learning. So the reason that we want to have all of these dimensions happening, and I have a little picture later on that shows how, it sort of gives us an indication of how these interact, right? So significant learning experiences are things that pull all of these together, right? So kind of like Shane's example, or service learning experiences often harness almost all of these dimensions at the same time, and they help students to learn the material far more powerfully and far more long-term if we're harnessing all these other things. But I also wanted to point out, before we go on, that a lot of the things that we come up with are exercises, right? Either things that we'll talk about or have them do, right? We'll have students keep account of how much money they spent on gas, right? Or their economic footprint. There were some really great assignments that some of the geography faculty came up with last summer, or the examples that Shane has already given us. And we jump right to the fun part, which is exercises, rather than measuring things, right? So measuring things is the really important but less fun bit, right? We don't really want to have to measure stuff, right? But so in fact, if we're reverse engineering a class, we need the goals first, but then the next thing we do is not come up with the exercises, the fun stuff. The next thing that we have to do is figure out, okay, how do I know that my students have attained these goals, right? How do I measure it? How do I measure whether or not they care more than they used to? Right, now again, sometimes the measuring may not be in terms of grades. It might just be, maybe you give them a survey at the beginning of the semester, and you give them another survey at the end, and see if their attitudes have changed. Right? There are lots of different ways that we can assess to some degree whether we have been effective in meeting these goals. They need not all be tied to grades, right? So we don't get to grade people on their moral stances, right? That is unethical for us, but it doesn't mean that we can't care about affecting them, right? That it may not matter to me that my students now are concerned about the fate of coral reefs, right? If I were a marine biologist, which I'm not, right? So it's okay for those to be very important goals of our class, right? Again, they just don't have to be tied to grades, but that doesn't mean that they can't be explicit goals of the class, right? No, you can also have stealth goals, right, that you don't necessarily share. But again, when you're designing your class, you really want to spend some time thinking about what you want to happen, right? So even if it doesn't make it onto the syllabus, you need to have decided for yourself what it is that I want to happen to my students, how I want them to be transformed, how I want them to be different. Because if you don't spend some time thinking about it, it probably won't happen, right? If you don't think about how am I going to make this, what is it that I want, how will I measure it, and then how do I achieve it, right? And so that's the fun bit, right? The exercises, the fun things we can have our students do, the experiential learning, the engagements, all sorts of things like that. But first, we have to think about where they're going and how we're going to measure it. So, I'm not going to ask you to fill it out here, but we have the notorious 3-column table that if you sign up for the Course Design Institute, you will see in much larger form. And we think about how will I know, right? So here, instead of assessment activities, I never really liked that term, assessment activities. I just want to think Whitney Houston instead and say, how will I know, right? How will I know if she really loves me? Or how will I know that they care about this, right? How am I going to tell? How am I going to be able to tell at the end of today and at the end of the semester whether I have made a difference, right? Whether the class has had any impact on the students or not. And then the learning activities, right? And so that's probably the most logical order to go in when you're designing the class. I think I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to be really quick. The next bit is just things that you might be able to do if you want to think more about this. And I did want to, Jennifer asked me especially to be a little more clear about the Course Design Institute. So last year, we had the very good fortune that the Course Design Institute was funded by the Provost's office. And they gave us stipends for 10 participants. And so we had a lot of applicants, and we were only able to take 10 of them. Hopefully this will expand this time and we may be able to run it twice. I think that the people who've participated have found it quite useful. At least we saw Kirsten's testimonial. And she even did that with no stipend, right? That was the first year. And people worked really, really hard for no remuneration, right? So it's worth it for the way that you're going to feel about your class in the end, and you get lots of peer feedback. But if you want to participate in that, we'll be sending out a call for participants early in the spring semester, and it takes place in the beginning of the summer, right? Hopefully right after spring semester is over. Our semester is starting a week later, so everything's bumped back a week, but they'll probably be in May or early June. And keep your eyes out for that. I also have a little packet that I have in PDF form, which is DFINC's self-directed guide to course design, and I can send you that anytime you want. And also please feel free to come by and talk to us about these things. We'll have a syllabus institute at the beginning of each semester, so just for more superficial issues, you can drop by and talk to us about that. And just get in touch if you have any other questions. So thanks very much. Oh. Oh, yes, thank you, Shane. Our office is in GL 154, so in the bottom floor of the library, in the little wing off to the east of Starbucks. Right. It's slightly hidden. There's not a sign that says where our office is. It's near where UTS is, down the same aisle. But for some reason, there's no sign that says we're there. We're kind of under the radar.
Also,
Okay.
if I may add to that, CAT has, Center for Advancement Teaching, CAT, has wonderful workshops, symposiums, and it's all on their calendar on their website. And it's a really fabulous resource.
And our website's a little out of date. We don't get to update it ourselves, but it's going to be changed soon. So hopefully it will be something that I can more readily update on my own. And the very last thing, I forgot to tell you about the last page here. This is something that I stole from the University of Virginia because they have the world's best course design institute. They're really, really good. This is what we wish we could be. And they have some nice verbs, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with those lists of verbs from Bloom's taxonomy, right? They have some nice verbs for thinking about the other dimensions of learning goals too, right? That students might be able to commit to or discover, whatever, right? So these might be useful for putting in a syllabus, so it's just a little extra thing, right? Any questions? Thank you very much. Have a good conference.